Hey Adela, how are you?
Hi, good. Can you hear me?
I can. You hearing me okay?
Perfectly.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks for joining us tonight. Appreciate it.
No, thank you.
So
And thank you for
appreciate
having
it.
me.
Pleasure. So want to welcome everybody to our live as Israel is now moving to its most dangerous phase of this operation, the ground phase. Obviously, the soldiers are on our minds. They're putting themselves at tremendous risk to fight this terrible homicidal ideology. Um, and we pray for all of them that'll keep them safe and protect the civilians behind them, and that they should all come home safely. Amen.
Yeah.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the latest news, right? What's going on, how this latest round started, and especially what we're seeing on social media. Seems things are blowing up the college campuses. What we're seeing from the far left in particular has been a great concern, and there's been a tremendous amount of anti-Semitism in social media as well. And I'm so glad to have you to talk about this because you have been sort of living this for a number of years. You're an NYU graduate. You are a Israel activist. You were involved in your own litigation at NYU that I understand was pretty high profile at the time and pretty intense. Uh, you're Syrian. You're from our community, so you understand the people that you're that are all tuning in. So, Adela, why don't you give us a quick introduction on yourself, some background, and what you've been up to?
Great. Thank you so much. And again, thank you to everyone who's watching. I think that this is extremely important, and there's nothing I'd rather be talking about right now. So, a little bit of background. My family is from Syria and from Lebanon. So, I'm Lebanese on my mom's side, Syrian on my dad's side. And they actually moved to Mexico, where I was born. And then we moved to Deal, of all places. And I grew up in Deal, and I went to Hillel from kindergarten to high school. In middle school, I was actually president of the middle school. And then in high school, I was in mock trial, model UN, debate team. I was on student council. I was on Torah Bowl and College Bowl. And I was in SBH, and I worked with the SN a lot. And
Mm-hmm.
I really came from the Syrian community. And then when I got to college, I wanted to go to NYU my whole life. And for some reason, I just didn't want to be the Jewish girl. I really wanted to branch out. And I really wanted, the Syrian community to be part of my life, but almost be secondary. I said, I'm Syrian, I'm Jewish, I'm going to come home for Shabbat, but that's not who I'm going to be in college. And I got very involved in absolutely everything. And I tried to really avoid getting involved in Jewish and Israel stuff because I wasn't who I wanted to be. When I found the group called Realize Israel, they actually, were in the park. They were giving out Israeli flags. I was walking by, and I'm Jewish, so I took a flag, and I didn't really know anyone. It was maybe my third, fourth week of school. And they gave me the flag, and they started, getting into a circle, and they started talking about people who lost their lives in a bus bombing earlier that week.
Mm-hmm.
And, I stood in the circle with my flag singing Hatikva, and I realized, I shouldn't be looking for a cause to fight for. I already have my own. So I didn't make Israel my whole life, but I said, at least let me join this group. And, later on, I went to be vice president, president, and it ended up shaping my entire career. Um, I got very involved in everything that was social justicey at NYU. It was something I really cared about at the time. I even wrote an essay about post-colonialism, and it got to the point that I realized that the person I was becoming wasn't the person I was at home, and I
It
had to
was
recenter.
it was quite a journey. You found the sort of the far left social justicey taking you away from your identity.
Yeah, for example, and I got very involved in everything. I joined student government. And when it came to the BDS resolutions, whether or not I wanted to, I was the Israel girl. Whether or
Mm-hmm.
not it's something I was, on student government my first semester, I mainly represented international students and students in Greek life. I wasn't really focusing on Israel at all my first semester on student government. And then suddenly everything became about Israel Palestine. I was actually involved in the Latino Student Union. And when it came to BDS, they said, you, Adela, of all people, are voting against, you're in the Latino Student Union. And they just kind of, it clicked in my mind that no matter what I do to try to be part of all of these causes and all of these groups,
It's not enough.
nothing will ever be enough unless I check my Jewish part, my real identity at the door. So I
Mm-hmm.
started doing a little bit more soul searching, looking more into myself. Who am I? What does it mean to be Jewish? What does it mean to be part of the Syrian community? And I realized that the Syrian community is absolutely beautiful and wonderful. I started listening to my grandparents and to my great grandparents and listening to their stories and asking my mom and asking the difficult questions. Who are we? Where did we come from? And I realized that our story is extremely unique. So a lot of people ask me why I support Israel. And of course, the narrative you'll hear today is that Israel was created as a refuge for people who were leaving from the Holocaust. It was a refuge state, but they were white colonizers from Europe. But then I think back to my story and I say, well, that's not necessarily my Jewish story. What my Jewish story is that we were growing up, well, our community was growing, was comfortable in the Middle East, had nothing to do with what was happening in Israel at the time in the 40s. And then suddenly after Israel comes to be, a Jew is a Jew. Whether or not you politically identified with Zionism, whether or not you were practicing or not practicing, and suddenly the Middle East turns against its Jewish communities. You see what happened in Iraq with the Farhud, where you had 2 days of basically killing of Jews and destroying their businesses, and no one even talks about it in the history books. For us, they made it almost impossible to live there as Jewish people. The economy was horrible. There was war breaking out. And again, a Jew became a Jew. And we ended up here in the US and we made the US our home. But if we learned anything, it's that you could be extremely comfortable as we were in Syria and Lebanon, but end of the day, you're still different. And that's why Israel's important for us to exist. It's important for us to be part of the diaspora, to be this proud, strong Syrian Jewish community, the strongest community of the Jewish world. And we know that. We are a shining example of what it means to be a diaspora. But at the same time, we have to understand that a diaspora means that you're part of a bigger community and you're elsewhere. But where is our home? And our home has always been Israel. And that's something I will always continue to fight for. So quickly, what happened at NYU and how I came to be an activist was, you know, being involved in the activist spaces at NYU and being constantly rejected, suddenly anti-Semitism starts coming to the forefront. Not only did we have a BDS resolution, we had a coalition of 53 groups. That's 1 in every 6 groups at NYU boycotting not only Israel, but Realize Israel, the group I was president of. And I kept meeting with administrators to tell them what was happening. And they all kept telling me I was overreacting, that, you know, nothing's actually happening. I'm making a mountain out of a molehill. And I believed them. Until we had a party for Yom HaAtzmaut called the Rave in the Park, where an anti-Israel student came with an Israeli flag and he just lit it on fire and threw it on the ground. This event usually has hundreds of Jewish students wrapped in Israeli flags, singing Hatikva, this beautiful moment that my mom, who goes every year, looks around and says, this is Judaism in the 21st century. New York City, full of Jews with flags, being proud of who they are. And during that moment, during that beautiful Hatikva moment, another anti-Israel student who was actually in a lot of my classes comes to the middle of the circle, grabs a microphone from a Jewish girl, wounding her in the process, and he ends up getting arrested for physical assault. They later took our 10-foot Israeli flag, tore it to shreds, and hung it from trees and lampposts. So you had this beautiful, beautiful event that we'd been doing for years, this Yom HaAtzmaut celebration in the park, full of positive energy, somehow turning to the exact opposite. You have our flag burning, hanging from trees, and a Jewish girl assaulted. And I put my foot down, and I went to the school, and I said, I'm not overreacting, and I need you to do something about this. And the school came back and told me that they were going to take action, but quietly and behind the scenes. And I naively trusted them. And everyone told me not to trust the school, but I truly believed the school would do the right thing. And less than a year later, they decide not only to not do anything, but to give an award to the group that burned the flag and basically assaulted a Jewish girl. That's what, and that's what led me to file my case against NYU for anti-Semitism. My case not only is the first case openly addressing anti-Semitism as a form of discrimination on college campuses, but I actually won, and it prompted an executive order by President Trump to officially include Judaism under Title VI protections.
So that's how you ended up on stage with Trump. I did see that happen. I was wondering how that happened.
Yeah. I filed my case. I spent the whole summer making as much noise as I could about it until I got a call from the White House, and they told me that they felt my case was important. They asked me to come speak on stage with President Trump. I said yes. And after speaking on stage with him 2 days later, they called me back from the White House, thanked me for speaking next to President Trump. Thank you for elevating my platform. And then they told me the good news that an executive order would be signed effective immediately to make sure that Jewish students are protected on campus.
Yeah, bravo. I mean, that's an unbelievable story. And I think it's a model for anybody who's on campus on what to do. It's worth mentioning now. I was going to mention it at the end, but we're working on a relationship now with the Lawfare Project. So it's Brooke Goldstein and Ben, his last name's escaping me at the moment.
Ryberg.
Thank you, Ben Ryberg. And we're going to be putting together a webinar for our high school and college age youth about what are their legal rights on campus in terms of access to facilities, what professors can and can't say, when is a legal bound crossed. People don't know, and I think some administrations, even just the code of conducts, are very complicated. So there are attorneys that will help, and we're going to be relaunching our SEA website in a few weeks, and we'll have a big resource page on that people could check out, and also have the ability to report incidents. And if it rises to the level where there needs to be some intervention with the administration or legal counsel, et cetera, we're going to help facilitate that. So I think it's an important resource, and really bravo for doing that. I'm sure it was not an easy thing. Must have been a lot of social pressure on you too, right? I mean, at the time, was it, did you lose friends? Were people looking at you like, oh, I thought I knew you, and how could you be doing this? What was the vibe like?
Of course. I mean, again, like my whole goal was not to be part of this mainstream world that I ended up making my entire life and I dedicated my life to. So at one point, the Middle Eastern Studies department, my classmates in my Arabic class wouldn't even partner with me for projects. They actually had to arrange for me to take my exams in a separate room. But the social pressure was the hardest. The social pressure was hard because I was, let's say, for example, in a sorority with a lot of left-leaning girls. And suddenly, I'm talking about anti-Semitism in Israel and the BDS resolution on student government. And suddenly I feel like I'm in the minority and I can't even speak up about who I am. Mm-hmm. Definitely after my Trump appearance, that's when I probably lost the most followers. That's where I lost the most friends. That's where a lot of people straight up blocked me because there's a very big dangerous ideology where it's an all or nothing zero-sum game, where you're either entirely for us or entirely not. And suddenly whoever you are as a person doesn't even matter. Mm-hmm. And it was very hard, but at the end of the day, I know I did the right thing. If the president of any country called me up and gave me a platform to talk about anti-Semitism, you have to recognize the platform, number one, and number two, his executive order is a good thing. For sure. Jewish students need to be protected the same way every other minority is protected. And you can't believe in the rights of one minority and then not believe that Jewish students deserve the same protection.
What is that about? So we have, look, I don't think that as a people where we play this, victim card as much, although that's there's sort of a victim Olympics going on out there. That I don't think is healthy for the country, for our community, and for us as a people to get involved in. And I'm happy that we don't do that. Nevertheless, our history does bear out a history of victimhood, right? And marginalization at times, to borrow a phrase from the far left. And now, what is it about our history of oppression that just doesn't get on the radar of these leftist movements? Why is it? Are we the Jew among the minorities? Is that what it is?
So it's a great question. And actually last night I was in a Clubhouse room. Clubhouse is an app where you hop on panels, speaker stage, and people can drop in and listen, similar to an Instagram Live, but it's just audio. And in this room, it just got so blatantly anti-Semitic. And at one point someone told me, you know nothing about ethnic cleansing and you know nothing about indigeneity.
Wow.
And as a Jewish person, and he said there are 4 types of ethnic cleansing. There's outright genocide. There's forced removal, there's like removal into groups, like relocations, and then there's also making life unbearable.
And then there's the Holocaust. Come on. I mean,
and
what are we talking about?
Exactly. I listened to him talk, and he's saying, you Jews know nothing about oppression, and you know nothing about genocide. And I unmuted my microphone. This is the point where I left the room. And I said, I'm sorry, excuse me, how dare you? Right. Talk to a Jew about genocide, because in the last 100 years alone, I can name an instance of every single one of those types of ethnic cleansing. Every single one of those types. Yep. And you know what it is with Jewish people, there's a couple of things I see. Number one, it's that because we were perpetually victims, because we were always moving around, we were always afraid to stand up for ourselves. Because if we stand up for ourselves, we draw attention to ourselves, and drawing attention to ourselves is dangerous. Why? Because when you distinguish yourself as a Jew is when you're distinguishing yourself as different. But that is not the case today. Why? Precisely because we have Israel. Because Israel exists, we're no longer the wandering victim Jew of the past. We are a strong nation. We're a strong nation with a country. We're a strong nation who are a peoplehood. We have our own ability to protect ourselves. We're part of every single country that we're a part of. We're part of their community. We contribute to their economy. We're leaders in every aspect. Why? Because we are a strong people and we shouldn't shy away from our strength. I don't know if you follow Rudy Rochman. He's a good friend of mine. And he always talked about Judaism and Zionism as exactly what every indigenous people strives for, which is we were a people away from our land. We were wanderers. Wherever we were different. Wherever we were persecuted. And finally, after 2,000 years, we returned to our homeland to establish a state for ourselves and really begin to protect ourselves and make ourselves a nation among the peoples of the world. Saying, yes, we are the Jewish nation and we exist. We have a right to exist and we are strong. We are the success story. We are what Native Americans, what Kurds, what people in Taiwan strive for, claiming our land, claiming ourselves, and claiming our identity. But we're still afraid to draw attention to our strength.
Yes, I think that's a big problem. You know, we have a long history of sort of trying to lay low in other places to not attract attention to ourselves. And, you know, and I guess in some cases and in some situations that may have been wise. I think today maybe less wise, and certainly with the blessing of the state of Israel in existence, it should be giving everybody more courage to step out and step up and to make their voices heard and to do so in a very assertive, always peaceful, of course, but in an assertive way. So it's an incredible story, and I'm so glad you shared it. And I think it'll be very helpful, and we'll post this afterwards for lots of the youth, especially because this is a bit of a preview of some of the things, hopefully not all of them, but some of the things that they may be, that may be headed their way. And I think it's also important for the parents to hear it because their kids are growing up in a completely different environment with really an entirely different language around these conversations. You know, words mean different things today. Sometimes they don't mean anything as they did, let's say, when my generation was growing up. You know, everybody today is a Nazi, it appears, apparently. I don't know. But things like that. And it's important that we stay closer to the younger generation and what it is that they're experiencing. So thank you for telling us all about that. It's very important for everybody to hear, not just the youth, but the parents as well. So bring us up. Yeah, sure, go ahead. No, please.
I just wanted to turn that to campus for a minute. So talking about this, like, you know, fear of being strong. Like right now, you see me as a strong Israel activist. I sued NYU. I stood up against anti-Semitism. But this went on in NYU for 2 years. And at the beginning, I was petrified. When the first statement came out that put Zionism in the same category as Nazism, racism, and fascism, we drafted a statement as a Jewish community. We came together. We wrote a beautiful statement talking about how outright disgusting and disrespectful it is to put Nazism and Judaism in the same sentence. Well, Nazism and Zionism. And we were ready to publish it. We drafted this as, like, you know, the 17 Jewish clubs at NYU came together. And it was actually a Jewish mentor of mine who called me the night before and said, do you really want to draw attention to this? Yes, they published a statement that put Zionism in the same category as racism and Nazism. But it's a statement published by a club at NYU. Most people didn't even see it. If you draw attention to it, you're really starting a campus war and playing into power politics. And I thought about that for a long time. And end of the day, even though the Jewish community drafted it together, I was president of the club, I was on student government, and the decision came down to me. And I decided not to publish the statement. And looking back, it's my only regret. Why? Because in that moment, I was so scared to stand up for myself. I was so scared to say, this is wrong, and I want to stand for who I am, because I didn't want things to get worse. And then fast forward to when I wanted to file my lawsuit, the same mentor called me and told me, you don't understand what you're doing. At NYU, we have a kosher cafeteria. We have a campus in Tel Aviv. We have a huge Jewish community. We're so comfortable here. Why are you going to sue NYU for anti-Semitism?
Oh, wow.
And I told him very clearly, I'm sorry, things are good. I'm happy we have a kosher cafeteria. But when a Jewish girl gets assaulted and an Israeli flag gets burned, and when it would have been any other people that aren't Jewish, it's a problem. But when it's us, we should just step by. There's an issue with conduct. When you're saying,
100%.
yes, things are bad, but things could be worse. We have a kosher cafeteria. That's an abusive relationship. There you're literally saying, like, oh yeah, God forbid, my husband hits me, but at least he buys me perfume.
Right. Yeah, no, that's very difficult. And I you know, when you're thinking back on it and you think about it as a regret, I think you should be a little kinder to yourself. I think, people evolve, and their positions evolve. And, I'll give you an example. We ran a cross high school program with Natan Sharansky. And if you've read his book, Never Alone, it's a tremendous book. And he even Natan Sharansky, who sat in the Soviet prison for years, right? The greatest human rights refusenik of our lifetime. He went through that same process. That he let things slide before he got himself to the point where he said, "All right, I'm gonna make a statement now. I'm gonna take a stand at this point." And so everybody needs to get there on their own terms and in their own time, and that's why it's good to have as many people involved as possible, because they're at different points in their lives and they have different things that they're considering, and as a people it all works, right? So you've certainly done more than most, and you should be very proud of yourself. And give yourself a pass on that one. I think that's all right. It took you another year to get it together. It's not a big deal. So now we're looking at this ground war in Israel. They think that this is a real estate dispute, that this is actually started from, which I understand is probably a pretext. But maybe you could go into that for a second, bring us up on the latest news of what you're hearing, and then we'll get into some of the other stuff we're seeing on social media. How about that?
Of course, 100%.
Right.
So you've probably all been seeing a ton of posts about the rockets that are going into Israel right now. And you probably heard about Sheikh Jarrah, which is a village in East Jerusalem. So not even a village, it's 6 homes. So let's walk through what exactly is happening there. So Sheikh Jarrah is a section of land in East Jerusalem that had 6 homes. In the 1800s, 1875, a group of Jewish people purchased the land and started to live there. So from 1875 to 1948, you have Jewish residences on this land. In 1948, we have the Israeli War of Independence, and the Jews have to leave because it falls under Jordanian control. Jerusalem was under Jordanian control in 1948 to 1967. So the Jews were forcibly, moved out of their homes. If we're talking about forced evictions, that was a forced eviction. And they really made Jerusalem an ethno city, because at that point, East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, the Jewish population was not allowed to enter. In 1967, which again is a defensive war, Israel gets attacked again, and at that point they retake Jerusalem. When Jerusalem falls back under Jewish control, Israeli control, what could have been done, which wasn't done, was to forcibly evict Palestinians that were living in the villages. They moved in when Jordan had control, not the villages, in the 6 homes. Again, it's 6 individual homes. When you hear Sheikh Jarrah, it sounds like there's a whole town that's being taken over. It's 6 homes on a plot of land in East Jerusalem. So the Jewish people who owned the land, they had the titles, they legally purchased it, said, these are technically squatters, we're going to take it to court. And from the 1980s until today, a decision has not been made on what to do with the land. And really what they were looking for wasn't even to get, they were looking to ideally get their homes back, or number 2, to have Palestinians pay rent as any other tenant would. They said, look, you don't even have to leave, but at least pay rent to the rightful owners, which again, they took the legal processes that they had to take. It was the most humane solution because, as we know, Israel plays on a different playing field and they have a different moral standard than every other country in the world.
Right. So this idea that Israel woke up one day willy-nilly and decided they're going to roll into a neighborhood, it sounds like, and all of a sudden up and get, all the indigenous populations, as they would say, out of it in some extra judicial proceeding is not accurate.
Not accurate at all. This dispute was going on for decades and decades and decades in courts, from one court to another court. And again, what they were looking for was a peaceful resolution. Right. So the idea, again, that Israel decided that they're going to start taking more land, and instead of building settlements, they're going to completely uproot Palestinians because that's what Israel does. No, that's entirely false. This was, again, a legal dispute that had to do with a plot of land with 6 homes. So as this is happening, the decision was supposed to be reached this week. And then a couple of things happened. Number 1, the elections for Abbas were coming up. And number 2, the decision started approaching. So all of this, and it's also Ramadan. So all
Mhm.
this led to protests, and protests are one thing, but as we saw here in the US, some protests are not protests, they're riots, and
Right.
riots are not a good thing. So this escalates into riots, very similar to what you would see in an intifada, because it became civilian on civilian violence. It
Hmm.
became, you saw all the visuals where it was Jewish people in their homes straight up with peyot, with, people running in the streets with knives. It looked bizarre. It looked like a war zone. And that's when the Israeli police stepped in.
Yeah,
And yes,
I did
mhm,
hear from some relatives and friends in Israel, and I'm talking to them, so concerned about what's happening in Gaza, and most of them said, Gaza, we kind of understand. We're shocked at what's happening inside our mixed cities, that we
mhm,
thought that we had excellent relationships going on here, and the Arab population within Israel that are Israeli are rioting violently, and not all of them. Certainly, there was a case. Um, where a Jew was
a
saved
Jew,
by an Arab,
yeah.
thankfully. And we don't want to paint any broad brushes, broad strokes here. But I think that has come as a shock to many people, that maybe there's bigger issues happening within these mixed cities than first thought to be the case.
Yeah, and it was something that was shocking because it's Jerusalem. It's the place where, we all walk around. We walk around the Arab Strip. We walk around, the Israeli Strip. You see the different cultures. I always tell people, like, if you want to know what Israel is, walk in Jerusalem and you'll see what
Hmm.
Israel is. And suddenly that walk in Jerusalem becomes dangerous. It becomes absolutely dangerous. And when the riots started, so you have the decision coming up, you have the delaying of the Palestinian elections, and then you also have at that point the protests that start escalating into riots.
Hmm.
Um, when things escalated into riots is when the Israeli police got involved, and that's when pretty much all the optics on social media and what you're seeing started. So first of all, it started with posts saying Israel is forcibly evicting Palestinians from their land. Watch how the Jews are violently, like the Jewish police violently during Ramadan, are shutting down
Right.
Palestinian free
And,
speech.
by the way, all the police are not Jewish, just as a point of fact.
Yeah,
In Israel, right? Which is an overlooked detail, I suppose, by the media.
as they do. Well, they
Right.
love overlooked details. That's
Right.
how it works. And probably basically all this starts to devolve into what you're seeing now. So Hamas sees all this uproar, all this turmoil, and I believe also all the support that they're getting on social media, and it becomes the perfect excuse to start firing rockets into Israel, saying,
Hmm.
not only are you evicting Palestinian homes, you're using force against against Palestinian civilians and Arab civilians, and therefore negotiation will never work, and it's time for us to resort to extreme violence and start showering the rockets down.
Hmm.
So that's where you have us, thank God, with the Israeli dome, with the Iron Dome, because without the Iron Dome, Jewish life, Israeli life, and also Palestinian life would
I
be
agree
still
with
in jeopardy.
I agree with that. If the Iron Dome didn't exist, Israel would have no choice but to go much heavier and much more quickly into Gaza and the other wherever they're firing rockets from. It does give them a little bit of space to kind of see if things get worked out before it gets that much worse.
It's true. And taking a step back for people who are listening in who don't know what the Iron Dome is, the Iron Dome isn't an actual physical dome that is over Israel protecting them. The Iron Dome is a technology system for missiles that whenever a missile is detected into entering Israeli airspace, a second missile is shot for them to explode in the air. So all the visuals that you're seeing that look like missiles hitting each other, that's what the Iron Dome does. And the Iron Dome is not 100% accurate, but it's so accurate that it's been able, again, to save hundreds of thousands of lives of people who are living in mainland Israel and people who are living in Gaza and the West Bank.
Absolutely. And I think here's a place to pause for a second, because I know some people, not some people, a lot of people are looking for ways to get involved and how to support Israel and what to do. And one of the ways, Jack Ashkenazi, for example, and many others, Jewish other people very involved with AIPAC, bring our relationship with AIPAC closer inside the community. And many of these defense systems are co-funded by the Congress, and it's important that continues to happen. So when you see the Iron Dome, although it's a tremendous, it's a tremendous technological advancement by Israelis, it may not have been possible without the support of the United States, and AIPAC is important in that role. So as people think about what to do, that's certainly a place to look.
100%. And it's the perfect example of, it doesn't matter where you fall politically. A bipartisan relationship between the US and Israel is absolutely necessary, because governments will continue to change, and government and elections will continue to roll by year after year after year. And unless we know that the US can continue supporting Israel, then we're also jeopardizing our friends and family that are there and the entire safety.
And Israel is the greatest strategic asset that America has in the region. So it's absolutely a two-way thing. It's the most reliable and most powerful ally in the whole region. And it's important that relationship, of course, stays very strong and bipartisan. And AIPAC there's no better organization sort of working to keep that intact, right? So go on. So what else are you seeing now? What's happening now, right? We're seeing celebrities jump in this. We're seeing it's happening on social media. Memes are all over the place. What's happening? It feels very sudden, although not unexpected if you've been following this sort of thing, as I know you have been. But tell us about where you think all this is coming from and what we could do about it and what you're seeing.
Of course. I mean, this has become not only a conflict on the ground where hundreds of people's lives are in jeopardy, but it's become about who has the most shareable content and who's getting their story out. Mm-hmm. And really what I see to be a very big player in this is the infographic. And really you saw this start up really back in the summer when we had, the riots for George Floyd, where an infographic and sharing an infographic became the way for people who mean well but don't actually do research to feel good about themselves and posting publicly. Not that it's a bad thing to repost an infographic, but it became a form of virtue signaling. And both people on the right and people on the left know this. Right. When you want to show that you care about a community, all you have to do is, instead of actually doing something, is repost an infographic. And what you'll find on college campuses always is what I call the human rights basket, where you have a ton of things in this basket, like racial equality, LGBTQ rights, feminism, animal rights, and they just keep throwing things into this basket. And unless you're ready to take the entire basket with you, then you're not really part of the basket and you're kicked out of the club. It becomes, again, a zero-sum game. And now with infographics, it's become, if you're sharing about one thing or one event that happened, if you're not sharing about all of them, then you are tone deaf and your silence is deafening and your silence is screaming and you're actually furthering. So we went from, actions being violent to silence is violence.
It's so
now
fun.
Firing rockets into Israel isn't violence, but not reposting an infographic about Palestine becomes violence.
Right. Silence is violence. Violence is peaceful, and it's all mixed up. It really is.
It's exactly what we saw at NYU. Burning an Israeli flag and physically assaulting a Jewish student was not only not alarming, it was being celebrated. They got an award for burning an Israeli flag, and that's how to be a stellar group at NYU. And now you look at exactly here. How do you become a stellar human? By supporting violence and doing the bare minimum, which is reposting things that are boiling down a huge centuries-old conflict into an infographic of two girls sitting next to each other going like this.
So let me say something I never thought I'd say in my life. Let's talk about Bella Hadid. Okay. So this is the meme that's heard around the world, right? This was the infographic that was heard around the world. She references apartheid, which is obviously completely inaccurate and unfair and the rest. Tell us, just walk us through that meme, just the general concept of it was shared tens of millions of times, and maybe you can just debunk the core notions that were expressed in that.
Of course. So Bella Hadid, as you may know, is a supermodel of Palestinian heritage. She's the sister of Gigi Hadid, who you might know from many international campaigns when it comes to fashion, high fashion, and media and everything. So Bella Hadid posted an infographic where the basic structure of it was two women sitting next to each other, one of them asking basic questions about the conflict, and the other one answering with these outright biased and mostly infactual answers. And of course, she references apartheid. So for the people listening who don't know what apartheid is, in South Africa, they had something called a de facto apartheid system. kind of similar to Jim Crow, but not really. Apartheid is where people are entirely separate. I was actually watching with Jeff a video earlier today. With an apartheid system, it is actual second-class citizens who don't have access to voting, who cannot run in government elections, who don't have access to education. Schools are separate. It's an actual apartheid system where you say these people are separate and they don't have equal rights in this country.
Right. It's truly systemically racist.
It's outright
that is
racist.
The definition of systemic racism is apartheid in South Africa version, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, in South Africa, apartheid was solved by saying we can all live together in peace. And South Africa still has a lot of issues, but until this day, it's no longer an apartheid country. People will argue that apartheid could be ingrained into systems, and that's a bigger conversation. But end of the day, under law, people are equal. So now let's look at Israel. What I said about walking in Jerusalem, and that's how you'll understand what Israel is exactly this. Because in Israel, you have Arab Israelis, you have Druze Israelis, you have Christian Israelis, you have Jewish Israelis, you have Muslim Israelis, you have religious Israelis, you have lesbian blue hair Israelis. And guess what? They all live together in the same country and they all have access to equal rights. Why? Because you're walking in the street and everyone's taking the same buses, everyone's eating the same foods, everyone can even be speaking their own languages. Israel is a truly democratic country.
When I served in the army, I was serving with Ethiopian soldiers and Druze soldiers and Christian soldiers. Was not even a thing. We used to call it. We referred to it as everybody's just green because of the uniform. Like no one really paid much attention to identity in that context. It was a diverse army. People sometimes don't realize that about Israel. I wanted to point that out too.
100%. So the claim that Israel's an apartheid country, the claim, which is also the basis of BDS, because the way that apartheid was solved in South Africa was that the international community said it's time to boycott South Africa until they start treating their Black citizens equally. And that's what the Palestinians claim, that they're using these building blocks from the most successful human rights movement. And that's why you should boycott Israel the way the international community boycotted South Africa. The difference is that the premises are entirely different. And there's a famous case of there were a couple of factories, I think SodaStream was one of them, in Israel that were being boycotted by BDS, whose employees were overwhelmingly Palestinian
they
or
put
Arab
Palestinians
Israeli.
out of work, right?
And certainly you have, dozens of people losing their jobs because the woke international community is putting pressure on Israel, not realizing that it's a lot more cohesive of a country than people think. Because under law, there is no apartheid. There isn't. And then there's a couple of other things that play into apartheid. So I was, again, in a clubhouse room last night, and they brought up a couple of things. Number one, they brought up checkpoints. They said that if you are from the West Bank or from Gaza, you have to go through checkpoints and checkpoints and checkpoints in order to get places, and that you have to take separate roads, that sometimes if you're on a bus and your bus driver happens to have a Palestinian ID card, you can't take a certain road, and then something that would take you 1 hour suddenly takes you 3. And they, the people in this room started saying, Israel's goal is to make Palestinian lives difficult, to separate them from the general Israeli community, to keep them separate, to keep them hidden away, and to add all the stress, right? And then I started talking about why the checkpoints exist in the first place, which is that in the year 2000, we had the second Intifada, where you have civilian attacks rising at a rate that was exponential.
That's right.
And what was being used was, number one, car bombs, number two, car rammings. So it's not enough to just check a car to make sure there's no bombs. It's that the car itself is a weapon. And since the checkpoints were installed in Israel, civilian casualties dropped by over 90% in 2002, in 2 years from the first Intifada onwards, because you're really blocking out the source where people can use these things as weapons. Absolutely. Another thing that people talk about, well, Israel has an actual apartheid wall that separates Gaza from Israel. Number one, the wall is actually a fence. The only parts of it are a wall. An overall majority, I think about like 78% of it is actually a fence, number one. And also there was over a 60% drop in attacks once the fence was actually put up.
Yeah, it worked.
So, and it's not that, the fence is holding people back necessarily. It's that it's a deterrent. Why? Because once you have a fence, you can also have people manning the border, which I know people don't like to talk about borders, but it's important when you have people coming in with the intention to kill. Yes, you can protect your border. So even for the people who lean further left, who are listening to this, who make the false comparison between the US and Mexico and Israel and Palestine. There's a difference between migrants coming in trying to make a better life. This is for the left-leaning friends who are listening to this. And there's a difference between people coming into your country with the intention to kill. They are very different from each other. One of them is something that we can talk about that's a longer political conversation. And the other one is black and white terrorism that must be stopped. And it's a false equivalence.
Also, I think in terms of the Mexico border, I think the left intentionally confuses the situation by equating a wall or a fence or a border with anti-immigration. It's just sort of illegal immigration. I mean, it doesn't mean you can't have as many immigrants as you want coming through. It just has to happen in an orderly fashion. But it's in their interest to paint it that way. And then you're right, that carries over to Israel, which is really a completely different situation where the security ramifications of not having a secure border are not theoretical, right? We know, as you said, what it was like before that was in place, and it was terrible. There were times when there were multiple bus bombings per day. I mean, it was just impossible to manage without it. So thank God that they did put that in place. Yeah.
And that actually takes me to the question of citizenship, right? Because the claims that Palestinians and people in Gaza are second-class citizens is something that's been floating around a lot of the activist circles. And it's very clear to understand, exactly like you said, that, you know, you're not anti-immigration, you just want legal immigration, right? So I'm actually, like I said all the way at the beginning, I'm from Mexico, right? And I'm not a US citizen. So when I enter the country, I go to a separate line that says foreigners, and other people enter through where it says citizens. Why? Because I'm not a citizen. So let's go back to Israel. After 67, Israel did give Palestinians the option of becoming citizens. And they said no. They said, we do not want to be part of your country. And from 67 onwards, when things, 67 to 2005, they still didn't want to be part of the country. And Israel, never fully offered every single, so we could get into the nitty gritty, but overwhelmingly Palestinians, the ones that did want to be part of the country became Israeli Arabs. And the ones who didn't kept themselves separate, so much so that Israel disengages unilaterally from Gaza. And Israel says, you want your own land and you don't want to be Israeli? Great, here is Gaza. And now they're complaining that they're being treated like non-citizens. But guess what? They aren't citizens. And Israel's responsibility is no longer there. They have their government structure. They have their school structure. They have a port. Gaza is almost entirely coastal land. Israel gave them everything that they needed to become Singapore. And instead, they decided to use all the foreign aid and all the opportunity that was given to ask for more, which is Gaza is not enough. What we need is from the river to the sea, meaning the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea, meaning the entirety of Israel.
Right, which is in effect a call for genocide. There's a lot of talk about the disproportionality of Israel's response, which is silly. I read, one is from a long time ago. I forget who said it, but it was one of the Israeli politicians at the time, maybe 20 years ago. I said, well, if disproportionality is the standard here, then the British were disproportionately harsh on the Nazis, right? So if you're just counting at the end how many people hit how many people on the other side, that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. And I saw something else that said, well, if you want to be completely proportionate, then Israel should just launch. Of course, they shouldn't, but Israel should just launch indiscriminate rockets in the other direction, and let's just match rocket for rocket and see how that goes. So the idea of proportionality, I think, is a means for them to just complain about the fact that they picked on a more powerful power. Probably not a good idea. And that they also picked on a country that has taken the time and made their resources and investments in protecting their population, not in going on the offense. Whereas I think the Palestinians have used a lot of their, not I think, they have, if you give them cement, they're building tunnels, less so schools, right? That's just the fact of the matter. So maybe you could talk a little bit about that piece of it, because you do see the images and they paint it as this David and Goliath scenario where Israel is just bullying. That's a word that we've seen out there. Why is Israel not the bully in this situation, even though with respect to the Palestinians, they are more powerful?
Well, this goes back to the real David and Goliath story, which is, of course, starting in 48. which is in 1947, the UN, which is not Israel, the UN, a separate body that everyone accepted as ruling over them at the time, said we need a state for two peoples. What a lot of people don't know is that the first partition was actually the Transjordan and Israel. That's right. The second partition became Israel-Palestine. The Jews were happy to take anything they can get because they were in the position where they had run from a genocide. Where do you go back to? Go back to where? And there really was no, at the time, organized Palestinian leadership. It was really the other Arab countries who said absolutely not. And
well, it was never a political entity.
It was never a political entity. It was under the Ottoman Empire, and I'm happy to go into the Ottoman Empire because it's my favorite topic to talk about. But, at the time, Israel said yes, the Jews said yes. The Arab countries, they weren't even countries yet at that time because the partition had just started. They were areas of influence. They rejected this deal, quote unquote. And they're the ones that launched 1948. So different to the US, which was, the Revolutionary War was people in the colonies saying it's time to fight for our independence. Israel's Revolutionary War was they were given the land by the UN and then they were attacked on all sides. There's two ways to secure land historically. How do you conquer, quote unquote, land? One is through treaty, and the second is through warfare. And Israel, unfortunately, within the same 2 years, had both. So arguably, if any country in this world has a right to exist, it's Israel, because not only was it recognized via treaty by an international body, but on top of that, when it was attacked, it protected itself. And in 48, no additional land was claimed, or very little of it. Between 1948 and 1967, you have the north in control of Syria, you have the West Bank in control by Jordan, including Jerusalem, and you have the south in control by Egypt. And in 67, again, they closed in. If Arab nations cared so much about Palestinian statehood, as opposed to general, the Palestinians living in Arab countries, because right now they're saying Palestinians can't just live in Arab countries because they have their own entity. If that's what they cared about, then from 48 to 67, in roughly 19 years, Jordan had the power.
Yeah, they could have given them
the power. Exactly, and Egypt had the power, but that's not what was in their best interest. So now we move to 67, which again, defensive war. Israel did not ask for 67. Israel did not ask to expand. They get attacked from all sides, and at that point they say, we are the David and Goliath story. We are the small against many. We are the Maccabees, and we're going to push back. And that's when we finally reclaim Jerusalem.
And at that time, the world did see it that way in general. The world did see Israel and as the David and Goliath story. So what's happening today? Why is it that, Israel obviously is more powerful than the Palestinians, but despite being surrounded still by many hostile Arab nations and certainly instability, I think maybe it comes down to sort of this meme culture and, there are images that come out that are not pretty and that people react to emotionally, really on both sides, but they don't really tell the story of what's actually going on. I think that might be part of it.
Well, it's about zooming in and out because everyone's seen the the famous picture that on one hand it looks like a person with a dagger, and when you zoom out, it's actually the other way around.
Yes.
It's again the famous image, and that's a lot of what's happening here, which is at the beginning, from its onset. If you want to make the argument that Israel didn't have a right to exist, it's all the Arab nations against Israel. And now if you zoom in 70 years later and you want to look at this micro view of Israel against the Palestinians, then you're discounting everything that Israel did to get there. And Israel, again, like I said, took it upon itself to be morally righteous, took it upon itself to say, we have the ability, the military ability, to do whatever we want. Again, Israel's a cake. Israel has the entirety of the land. They have the full cake. If they were really looking for genocide and expulsion, the way the Nazis said we must eradicate Jewish people, then what was stopping this horrible nation who is literally existing to destroy Palestinian lives? Right. And the truth is that Israel doesn't exist to destroy Palestinian lives. Right. Israel exists because we were a hurting people, a wandering people, a victimhood people, a stateless people that returned to our homeland. And once we returned, we always talk about, well, what does peace look like?
And some of us never left.
And some of us never left. We had continuity in the land, which also is what, to claim indigeneity. And everyone, like saying that, and I'll talk about this in 1 minute, but at that point, saying that the Jewish people suddenly showed up in the settler colonial state and that this disproportionate force is because Israel wants to destroy Palestinians, doesn't actually look at the real picture. So you have two things at play. Number one, people say, well, the Palestinians negotiation doesn't work. They feel like they are frustrated. They feel like Israel is not giving them fair terms. And that's why the Palestinians must fight back with resistance, with violent armed resistance. The issue is that they're condoning extremism, and they're saying that extremism is the only resort. On the opposite end, they're saying that Israel uses disproportionate force. So here you're saying extremism is when negotiations fail, you take to extremism. Guess what? Israel is also frustrated. Israel tried negotiating multiple times. In the last 20 years alone, they proposed two amazing peace deals that gave more and more land each time, including Jerusalem, and it was still rejected. So by the same standard, then Israel has a right to say, well, you know what? Negotiations didn't work. Let me take to force. But then you get to the disproportionate force argument, which is, you're right. Israel has more resources right now, and Israel has in its ability, and it's in its full cake, that if it wanted to, it can. But greenlighting that is a human tragedy. And the fact that they're even talking about how on the other end, because you would never hear someone like me, I would never say, you know what Israel should do? It's time to ethnically cleanse.
Yeah,
but what they're saying is that they're condoning ethnic cleansing on the other side.
Yeah, I read a book a few years ago about this, or it was an op-ed piece, I think, and it basically said, if Israel could do anything they wanted to the Palestinians, what would it be? Well, we know the answer to that question, because they can, right? And if the Palestinians could do anything they wanted to the Israeli state, what would they do? Well, I think we know what they would do. And they're kind of lay bears the facts of the matter, which is, on the one hand, you really do have a genocidal force in Hamas, stated in their own charter publicly, without question. And on the other hand, you really do have a country that could do all these terrible things, which they would never do, if they so chose to. So it's just curious how they could be accused of doing something that they can so easily do, but are not doing it.
Because it's not in our interest. And if we could take a zoom back,
and it's against our values, right?
Yeah. No, entirely. Not only our Israeli values, but our Jewish values.
Of course.
And speaking of Jewish values, I want to zoom out for a little bit and give a little bit of a history lesson, right? Because the way that this conflict is treated, like when you hear that Israel is a white settler colonial state from European Jews, makes it sound like Judaism started existing yesterday. They make it sound like we just kind of showed up out of nowhere and said, this is ours, and set up this white ethno state.
And these are the same people that follow the Quran. So that is very curious, because if you read the Quran, it's a history. I don't want to say it's a history, but it certainly references us living in the region. They were trying to get us to become Muslim at the time, right? We were in Saudi Arabia. We were in Mecca. That's why Muhammad left and went to Medina when he wasn't able to win the Jews and the Christians over. So clearly we were there, right? And there was go on.
I was just going to say that, what a lot of people don't understand is that, like, the Torah came first with the Jewish people. And then, you have the Bible, which is the continuation of the Torah, the New Testament, where they accept the Torah to be true. It's the Old Testament. And then on top of that, they have Jesus' word and apostles and his followers. And that's the New Testament. What people don't realize is that the Quran comes after Christianity, accepting both the New Testament and the Torah. So Islam and the Quran is really the third book of this series. So if what they're saying is that everything that came before is true, then by their own religion and by their own history, Jews are indigenous to the land of Judea.
Correct.
We are from here. So if you want to start history in the 1800s, when European Jews start buying up land, number one, you're forgetting the fact that Jewish people had been living in Israel with continuity from before the Ottoman Empire, continuing straight. Number two, you're forgetting the fact that when Jewish people were exiled from this land during the various wars,
Romans,
we want to talk about the Romans, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Persians. We could talk about all the occupations that they had in Judea when we were exiled.
Yeah,
we were still living in the area. We had a rough run. And you know this, we're in the Sephardic Cultural Association. We have Jews in Persia. Why? Because we were exiled to Persia. We have Jews in Syria, in Lebanon, in Morocco. We're all over the place. And then when we
Mhm.
were in Spain, guess what? Inquisition comes along and we go back to other places. We're
Right.
constantly wandering. Why? Because we're Jews from Judea, and we've been a wandering people from exile to exile. And you want
Mhm.
to talk about the Damascus blood libel, you want to talk about the Rhodes blood libel, you want to talk about all the times that they're using blood of other people, saying that Jewish people care about spilling blood. It is not true. It's anti-Semitic tropes that you're seeing time and time again. And with
Agreed.
Sheikh Jarrah, you see this happen in two ways. Number one, you see your typical, neo-Nazi type propaganda where they start talking about Jewish power. They start
Mhm.
talking about Jewish landlords, about Jewish titles,
Right.
about Jews controlling the media, and that's why you don't hear about Sheikh Jarrah.
Yeah. You got the far right conspiracy theories, and that's a threat as well as the far left. It comes
But they're
from both
being
directions.
adopted by the far
Yes,
left.
I agree with that. I agree with that. You go full circle and they kind of meet at some point. So I want to be respectful of your time and the people that tuned in. And I know it's very important that we give some people some concrete steps and tips. Why don't you talk just a minute about student government, what students should be thinking about doing on campus, who they should be in touch with, how to navigate that. Give us a minute on that.
Of course. So there's a lot of young people listening to this, and a lot of parents, and a lot of people who specifically are in high school or are going or are in college currently.
Mm-hmm.
When I was in school, I again tried to fit into every group I possibly could, and that was never enough. And until I started standing strong for who I am, I didn't come into myself. I didn't feel true to myself, and I didn't actually become someone that can be a change maker. The most important thing to remember is that student government is not important until it's the only thing that's important. If
Yeah,
you're
can
current,
you just pause there for 1 second?
Mhm.
Because for the adults that are watching, I want to point out there is a correlation, I think, about student government as city councils. You don't think about them, but they have tremendous power over your day-to-day life. Like you're involved in national politics, but what's happening on a national level affects us a lot, but maybe certainly local politics affects us very much too. And student councils, you're right. It's easy to ignore them and to not think there's much, going to happen there. But go on. Things really do. It's an important place. You need to pay attention to it.
Yes. Again, like I got lucky in that I always wanted to be on student government. So I was there before BDS started, and I was able to be in the room as a senator with speaking rights during the first BDS vote that we had at NYU.
You got
But
grandfathered in.
I got grandfathered in.
Right.
But if you're not on student government and you don't want to be on student government, guess what? Student government is meant to represent students. So what do? If your student government hasn't taken a stance on this, the most important thing you could do is reach out to your student government representatives and tell them, I am a student at your school. You represent me. My community is hurting. My community is aching. If you're going to take a stance on this, if you're going to push for BDS, you have to remember you're alienating a large part of the people that you are meant to represent. You have to hold them accountable. Exactly like the left says, accountability. It's time that we push for accountability. More importantly, if you can possibly either you run or someone else run for a student government position, I believe this year is a crucial time to start getting involved and politically activated. But the most important thing to keep in mind, and I wish someone told me this 6 years ago when I was a freshman in college, is please do not be afraid to say that you belong there. When I sued NYU, I didn't just sue NYU because I'm Jewish. I sued NYU because I was a Jewish NYU student. And I was being treated differently because of my Judaism than other students. And we deserve to be there just as much as everyone else. So just as much as you're a student and you deserve representation, you should claim to be represented.
Great.
And same thing here in the United States. If you're a citizen of the US, you're a United States citizen. If they're treating you differently, discriminating against you because you're Jewish, that's anti-Semitism, and it's time to call it out. Don't be afraid to finally stand up for yourself, because I wish that's something I knew earlier.
That's great. Terrific advice. There's some other activists in the community I want to mention if people want to get involved, the young adults want to get involved. We have some wonderful young people. Michael Harari and Frida Cohen started an organization, Enough is Enough. You should follow them on Instagram. They're getting started with some wonderful programming. They've already had some of that happen. Soli Hakim is a senior at Hillel. He started the YIAC, the Young Israel Advocacy Coalition. You know him. He's doing great work. He's an amazing guy. Homegrown, he's one of ours, which is great. And then there are national organizations that we've already begun working with. One is called Tikkva Fund. So if you go to tikkvafund.org, it's an incredible resource. If you really want to get deeply educated, they have Tikkva Academy, they have the Yale program, which some of our kids are going to be able to attend. But I encourage adults, they have different age groups, different grades and everything, to go to tikkvafund.org, go online, see what they offer, find anything you're interested in, just start. You know, I was asked a question, they did an interview for me about how I got involved in supporting Israel and what, you know, what people should be doing, how they should become involved. And my answer was the same then as it is today, which is to just, there are so many different ways. Just start educating yourself, and you'll find the place that really speaks to you. And there are so many organizations like an APAC, like a Lawfare project, and also, you know, obviously the high schools are really on top of all this too, and there's lots of resources. Hillel, Mag and David, Flatbush, Barkai. I saw a beautiful email today from Mag and David laying out a tremendous amount of resources that they put in place. I know Flatbush is always on top of this. Barkai is already, you know, you feel like you're in Israel when you walk into it in the first place. And Hillel is doing tremendous work in this area. So the students have resources in their high schools as well. The SCA is going to be putting together a resource center on our website in the coming few weeks that's going to be accessible to everybody. People should try to get involved with the people in the community that are already doing this work. And Adela, I'll let you sort of say the last words. I want to thank you for coming. You're an inspiration and a tremendous resource to our community. I'm so happy that you agreed to be a regular contributor to the SCA content in this area and helping our students navigate. You are from the future for them, right? So you're able to give them the benefit of your experience and your wisdom. It's just terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. I hope that this was helpful, and I hope I can continue to be helpful. And, you know, for all the students that are listening, I went to the same schools as you. I did the same things, the same organizations, and I was able to go to actually change something on the ground. I took legal action against NYU. My case led to a breakthrough in anti-Semitism law in the US. So really dream high, dream as high as you possibly can, because your voice can make a difference. So thank you, everyone, for starting from now. And I wish I would have started sooner.
Okay, great. Thank you, Adela. We appreciate it. Thanks for everybody for tuning in. You'll see more of us again in the future, I hope. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.